Picture 10 volcanic islands sitting in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, completely empty of human life, until the exact moment ships from Europe decided that emptiness was an opportunity. Cape Verde, the small archipelago off the coast of West Africa, is one of the strangest nations on Earth, because unlike almost every other country in Africa, it had no native population at all before outsiders arrived. There were no indigenous kingdoms, no ancient tribes, no written history stretching back thousands of years on these shores. Instead, Cape Verde's story begins in the 5th-10th century, when Portuguese explorers stumbled onto uninhabited volcanic rock and decided to build something entirely new. What followed would turn these islands into one of the most important and most tragic crossroads in the history of the Atlantic world. To understand why Cape Verde became so mysterious, we first need to understand the real history. In 1460, Portuguese navigators sailing under the Crown's expanding exploration program reached the islands and claimed them for Portugal. Unlike other African territories, which were conquered from existing populations, Cape Verde was settled from scratch. The Portuguese brought colonists, and almost immediately, they brought enslaved Africans from the nearby coast of present-day Senegal, Guinea, and other West African regions. Because there was no native population to displace or absorb, the people who would eventually call themselves Cape Verdean were created through forced mixing between European colonizers and enslaved Africans, a population born entirely out of colonization itself. By the late 1400s, Cape Verde had become one of the very first hubs of the transatlantic slave trade, a staging post where enslaved people were held, sold, and shipped onward to plantations across the Americas. This is where the true point of divergence in our story lies. Not in a single battle or a single vote, but in a single geographic accident that changed everything. Cape Verde sits almost exactly between West Africa and the Americas, along the trade winds that Atlantic sailing ships depended on to cross the ocean efficiently. That location was not something anyone planned. It was simply where volcanic activity happened to push land up from the ocean floor millions of years earlier. But because of that accident of geography, when European powers began building the transatlantic slave trade in the 15th and 16th centuries, Cape Verde became almost unavoidable as a stopover point. Now imagine for a moment that those trade winds had pushed sailing routes just slightly further north or south, missing the islands entirely. What if Cape Verde had never become a required waypoint on the Atlantic crossing? This is the point where our alternate history begins to take shape. In this alternate timeline, without the trade winds funneling ships directly past Cape Verde, Portuguese explorers might still have discovered the islands, but they would have had far less reason to build permanent settlements there. Without a reliable flow of ships needing to stop, resupply, and trade, the islands would likely have remained a minor outpost, visited occasionally but never developed into the bustling colonial hub it became. The immediate consequence would be enormous. The transatlantic slave trade did not disappear in this scenario, because the demand for enslaved labor in the Americas was driven by plantation economies in Brazil, the Caribbean, and North America, not by Cape Verde itself. But the routing of that trade would have changed. Other staging points along the West African coast, places like the Gold Coast, Senegal's coastal forts, or islands further south, such as Saint Tomé, would have absorbed the role Cape Verde historically played. The horrifying machinery of the slave trade would have found another gateway, because the economic forces driving it were far larger than any single island chain. As the decades moved forward in this alternate scenario, Cape Verde would have remained sparsely populated, perhaps home to a small number of Portuguese sailors, missionaries, and a handful of African laborers, but without the dense, mixed population that historically defined the islands. Here comes our first major turn, the moment where the alternate scenario stops going the way most viewers would expect. You might assume that without the horror of the slave trade passing directly through its ports, Cape Verde would have had a gentler, better history, but the opposite may well be true. Without becoming a colonial hub, Cape Verde would likely have remained one of the poorest, most neglected corners of the Portuguese Empire, receiving almost no investment, no infrastructure, and no strategic attention from Lisbon. The very brutality that built Cape Verde's economy in real history is also what eventually gave the island schools, ports, administrative structures, and a class of educated Cape Verdean intellectuals who, centuries later, would lead the fight for independence. Take that historical engine away, and you may remove the very foundation that allowed Cape Verde to develop the strong sense of national identity it holds today. Moving further into this alternate timeline, by the 18th and 19th centuries, real Cape Verde had developed something remarkable, a genuinely unique Creole culture, blending Portuguese language with West African linguistic structures into Cape Verdean Creole, a hybrid identity found almost nowhere else on Earth in quite the same way. This cultural fusion happened precisely because the islands became a permanent, isolated meeting point between European and African peoples over 3 centuries of continuous contact. In our alternate scenario, with far less population and far less permanent settlement, this cultural fusion either happens much more slowly or barely happens at all. Instead of a distinctly blended Creole society, the islands might have remained a patchwork of transient sailors, missionaries, and small farming communities, more comparable to other minor, forgotten Portuguese holdings than to the rich cultural entity Cape Verde became. Now here is our second major turn, and this one concerns the devastating famines that shaped real Cape Verdean history, because the real islands became densely populated and heavily dependent on the slave trade, and later on cash crop agriculture controlled from Lisbon, they became extremely vulnerable to drought. Cape Verde experienced repeated devastating famines throughout its history, some of which killed a significant percentage of the population, because colonial administrators prioritized exports over feeding the local people. In our alternate history, with a much smaller population, this specific tragedy might never happen at the same scale, simply because there would be fewer people dependent on a fragile, externally controlled food system. It is a strange and uncomfortable insight that in trying to imagine a better version of Cape Verde's history by removing the slave trade, we may have also removed the population growth and economic entanglement that eventually led to some of its greatest suffering, while also removing the cultural richness that made Cape Verde so distinctive in the first place. History rarely offers a clean trade, where you can remove the bad and keep the good. And this alternate timeline forces us to reckon with that uncomfortable truth. Let's continue building the long-term consequences of this divergence. In real history, the 20th century brought Cape Verde into a shared liberation struggle with Guinea-Bissau under the leadership of Amilcar Cabral and the PAIGC movement, which fought for independence from Portugal and eventually succeeded in 1975. This partnership existed because both territories shared a common colonial administrator and a common revolutionary vision for African liberation. In our alternate scenario, with Cape Verde remaining a minor, underpopulated outpost rather than a significant Portuguese colony, it is very possible that no strong independence movement would have emerged from the islands at all. Without a substantial population, without an educated Creole elite, and without the deep colonial entanglement that historically radicalized Cape Verdean intellectuals, the islands might have simply drifted along as an afterthought of empire well into the 20th century, potentially remaining under Portuguese or even later international administration, far longer than in real history. Here is where the story takes its final, most consequential turn. Even if Cape Verde had remained a minor colonial holding through most of history, the broader wave of African decolonization sweeping the continent throughout the 1950s, 60s, and 70s would still have applied enormous pressure on Portugal to release all of its African territories, not just the economically significant ones. Portugal, under immense international and military pressure, and drained by costly colonial wars in Angola and Mozambique, was already moving toward withdrawal from Africa entirely by the mid-1970s, regardless of any single territory's importance. This means that even in our alternate timeline, Cape Verde likely still gains independence around a similar era, but as a much smaller, much less developed, and far less culturally distinct nation than the one that actually exists today. It might have entered independence with almost no experienced local administrators, no established diaspora network, and no unifying Creole identity to rally around, making its post-independence path significantly more unstable than the real Cape Verde's relatively peaceful transition to democracy. This brings us to the larger insight this alternate history reveals. The real Cape Verde that exists today, a small, resource-poor island nation that nonetheless boasts one of the highest literacy rates in Africa, a stable multi-party democracy, and a globally influential musical culture through artists associated with Morna music, exists precisely because of the painful, complicated, and often brutal history of colonization and forced population mixing that built it. The very forces that caused immense suffering, the slave trade, colonial neglect, and devastating famine, also inadvertently created the dense population, the linguistic fusion, and the educated leadership class that allowed Cape Verde to become one of the more successful post-colonial nations in Africa. This is one of history's most uncomfortable patterns, that national identity and cultural richness often emerge not despite suffering, but tangled directly within it, making it almost impossible to imagine a version of history where a nation keeps its strengths while erasing the pain that produced them. Cape Verde's real mystery, then, is not some hidden secret buried in its volcanic soil. It is the simple, unsettling fact that an entire nation, with its own language, its own music, its own sense of identity, was manufactured almost from nothing, out of forced migration, empty islands, and centuries of hardship, and somehow produced something the world now recognizes as genuinely, remarkably its own. So the next time you look at a map and see those 10 small islands floating alone in the Atlantic, consider this. How much of what we call a nation's identity is truly organic? And how much of it is simply what remains after history has finished doing something unimaginable to a piece of land and the people forced to call it home?